conversation. My name is Shannon Taylor. I'm the executive director, and with us this lovely evening are two very special guests. And that's the novelty of this show. Right behind me is the Honorable Gerald Lebovitz of the Housing Court, New York County, and Professor David Gordon of History, American and European from NYU. And where are you? I get these confused because our organization has been all over the place. At all of these colleges, they're all lumped into one as far as I'm concerned, like the courts. When you visit all these places at all these times, you forget where exactly one is as opposed to the other. But Housing Court, of course, has its own bailiwick, and no one forgets Housing Court when they go to Housing Court. So let's begin with you, Judge Lebovitz. Why don't you tell me exactly what takes place on the average case? Let's say it's not somebody who is summoned to Housing Court, but a tenant wants to go to Housing Court, and they find you. Introduce yourself and your credentials, because I couldn't do justice to them, there are too many, and then tell me what is the average day that would take place for the average tenant who says, my apartment just isn't satisfactory, things are wrong, I'm not getting the common benefit of it, and yet they want me to pay rent. So, Your Honor, what do I do as a tenant in this situation?
Do I begin with my qualifications and then continue?
Absolutely. Begin with your qualifications.
Okay.
The tenant walks into your court, doesn't have the benefit of what they're going to have now by way of your introduction, but our audience does.
All right. I went to college and law school in Canada. That's where I'm from. And I got a graduate degree from Tulane University School of Law in New Orleans, Louisiana, and another one from NYU Law School. After that, I did a variety of things. I was a legal aid lawyer in the Criminal Defense Division. I was a law clerk to a state Supreme Court judge for many years. I taught at New York Law School for 18 years, and currently I teach part-time at St. John's University School of Law. A tenant who comes to that, and then I was appointed 6 years ago and serve in Manhattan Housing Court at 111 Center Street. That's part of the Civil Court of the City of New York. The Civil Court has three parts, one of which is the housing part, another one of which is the small claims part. The next part is called the plenary part, which hears money-only cases for $25,000 or less. A tenant who comes to housing court can come because the tenant has a case, for example, a repair proceeding, and then the tenant is the plaintiff, called a petitioner. And a tenant can come to housing court because the tenant is sued. Then the tenant would be the defendant, and that person would be called the respondent responding to a case in which the landlord would sue the tenant. If the tenant brings the case and is the petitioner, then the tenant is suing for repairs, saying, Judge, there are conditions in my apartment. The landlord is responsible for fixing them. There might be housing code violations or building code violations or health code or noise code violations. Judge, issue an order requiring the landlord to fix the violations, and then if the tenant can prove there are violations, the court will order the landlord to repair, and if the landlord does not repair, the landlord can be punished by sanctions or by contempt, maybe even by going to jail. A tenant can also say, in response to a non-payment petition, the reason I did not pay the rent I supposedly owe is that there are conditions in my apartment, and so I don't have to pay the amount of rent that the landlord says I owe, but I should get a rent abatement for the conditions in my home. That would be in a non-payment case, and the tenant would, if successful, be directed to pay rent, but less rent than the tenant might otherwise owe, using the warranty of habitability as a defense.
Thank you. Now, of course, I recommend that for those who don't understand this, you get a lawyer, and the process can be lengthy. let's turn to Professor Gordon. I understand that the period of time you'd like to discuss is filled with all that consternation and hate regarding the American First movement, which was opposed to the war, which was symbolized by Lindbergh, misunderstood as a heroic figure, and actually was pro-Hitler, although he redeemed himself to some degree by becoming extremely pro-wildlife conservation as the founder of the National Wildlife Federation and Foundation, and led to Pan Am. But put yourself in a situation where these immigrants are coming to America for homes and apartments. And you've just heard today's housing court situation from Judge Lebovitz. How does that situation compare to how one would have found a home in the 20s or 30s pre-war situation, confronted with the American First movement? Would they have been welcomed? Would they have found a place to live? Would it have been their own home? Or would they have been living with 10 in a room, waiting for immigration or waiting for some hate-filled movement to kick them out? And as with Judge Lebovitz, would you give your qualifications first?
Yes, David Gordon. I was born and grew up in New York City. I went to Brooklyn College in the great days of the City University before open admissions. I subsequently got my MA and PhD at Brown University. Before coming to the City University to teach, I taught at the University of California system at Riverside, the University of North Carolina systems, both at Chapel Hill and at Charlotte. I've been a seminar director at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, and also taught for 2 years as an exchange professor at the Sifandashua, the Kaohsiung Teachers University in Kaohsiung in Taiwan. At present, I teach in the history department of Bronx Community College, and also at the Graduate Center of the City University, which, as you know, is catty-corner with the Empire State Building. I also occasionally and very happily teach a course in American history at the NYU McGee School of Continuing Education. The question of immigrants in America, it's very different back then from today. It was very different, which is to say immigrants could not enter this country except with great difficulty. The amount of illegal immigration was minuscule, and immigration from Europe was extremely restricted. Within the city of New York, in those days, there was a considerable amount of neighborhood segregation, and several neighborhoods where refugees, certainly Jewish refugees, were not allowed to live. Among them being Jackson Heights. Jackson Heights was a restricted community, and right through the time of the Second World War, the courts enforced that restriction, so that there was a famous case in the 1920s of a Jewish family that moved into Jackson Heights, and the Queensboro Corporation that owned that entire development went to court, and the court upheld the desire of Queensboro to put them out. Housing was very tight because of the Depression, and it was going to continue to be very tight through the Second World War. And that extremely tight market only ended at the end of the war with the beginning of the suburbanization of Long Island. Is that sufficient?
Yes,
okay.
It's quite sufficient. Now let's get into the controversial part of the housing situation at present. Controversial only in the sense that I want to ask if there are enough homes to go around in Manhattan. Judge Lebovitz.
There aren't enough homes to go around in Manhattan. There certainly aren't enough affordable homes to go around in Manhattan. Affordable housing is limited. I think it always has been in New York City, and sadly, it always will be limited in New York City. It's a scarcity of resources that, among other things, will drive up prices for apartments, for rentals, to buy apartments, co-ops and condos and all of that. And it's that scarcity of resources that will lead to more cases in housing court, which is probably the busiest court in the United States, with 350,000 new filings a year heard by 50 housing court judges.
Professor, when you have students who are housed on campus, is it because they don't have housing available in the city, or they prefer to be housed in campus, or they would rather live outside of the city? What is that situation, and how does it affect their education?
Oh, well, to tell you frankly, I know very little about that. I can tell you that the City University of New York has no on-campus housing at present. There's just some talk of some being built now, but in the past we've had none. I also teach in the School of Continuing Education at NYU, and those are students who have full-time jobs for the most part, and they have lives that are basically centered off out of NYU, out of the Washington Square area, though they do come in the evening for classes. So I'm afraid that's the best I can do in that regard.
I think there's a Burns building, Haywood Burns, if I'm not mistaken, that's part of City College, a new building.
If it is,
I
perhaps,
could be
happy.
mistaken about
I'm
that.
happy to hear it, but in that case, it would be very new, because traditionally there had been no housing, and as far as I understand, there was some opposition in the state legislature, led by Sheldon Silver, against building any dorm housing for the City University, because somehow this was regarded as elitist. So, but I am happy to hear that we're turning that corner a little bit. That's a great step up for the City University.
Your Honor, Haywood Burns is a famous civil rights crusader, was he not?
Yes, and the dean of the law school of the City University at Queens College.
Thank you both, and I want to welcome you to our next show, which will be forthcoming. Judge Gerald Lebovitz of Housing Court, New York County, a dear friend of many, many years, and a new friend to our program and to our organization, referred by our wonderful colleague and founder, Maria Doty, Professor David Gordon of CUNY and of Bronx Community College. Thank you.